Okay, so if I can just comment
Yeah, sure.
on everything that everyone has said, I do want to give a couple of disclaimers. Is that I do not know why I've become the spokesperson for BLM within the ex-Muslim community. Um, and
No, I think there is a reason why that's
and
happened,
I
Faye.
do
That's
hold on,
because you
hold
did a
on, hold on,
video.
hold on,
It's because you did a
hold
video
on,
calling out people who weren't.
hold
That's
on,
why it's happened.
Okay,
hold
let's.
on.
I'll
In
try
It's of your
moderating
own
this.
making. It's
in
of
no
your own
no,
making.
I get that. I get
Mm.
that, but at the same time, I've not been discouraging the other side. Actually, within those videos, I have said, I don't care what your opinion is, just say it. And I feel like there's been a lot of skipping around the issue or
Mm.
two-timing and double-teaming and not really coming out with what you actually believe, and that's what's been bothering me.
And why
Um,
do you think that might be, though? Why do you think people might be
let
being
me
hesitant
let
around
me
this issue
let
to
me
come
So
finish.
forward?
I
let me
wanna.
moderate this.
Okay, you guys had like it's been 17 minutes. I said two sentences.
Yeah.
Can I please speak? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Um.
I'll moderate this. Faye, you talk, and
Okay.
then I'll pass it along.
So, in terms of what Obeda said about not being able to have normal and proper discussions, as someone who holds a lot of libertarian ideals, I do believe in having normal and proper discussions. I do believe in people holding opposite opinions and having the ability to talk about them, because I think that's the only way we can reach conclusions that are valuable, and we're able to talk about these things and reach a conclusion that actually makes sense for everybody. And it's one of the reasons why, even though a lot of people have told me, no, you should back out of this, there's 4 people who are going to be going against you, and it's just going to be you saying the same thing over and over again. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to come here and do this. Jimmy, you told me that it's always been easy to disagree with me, and that's because I'm the oldest in an Indian family, and I've always been disagreed with my whole life. So it's easy for me because I understand disagreement and understand coming from another place. And I also want to say that I'm not the most educated on like sociological identity politics and things like that. I know some social psychology. I understand riots and riot dynamics and ideologies, but I'm not the most grounded in identity politics, because I believe that at some point you have to just accept your lot in life, and you get what you get, and you have to just deal with it sometimes. But at the same time, I do think that, well, Jimmy also said that we're a dialogue-oriented community, right? And I do agree with that. We are a dialogue-oriented community. So when I saw the lack of dialogue,
Mm.
it bothered
Mm.
me, and it made
Yeah,
me
I can see.
angry. And in terms of, like, I've noted down quite a few things. So in terms of systemic racism, I do think that there is a case to be made for it. I think that it's difficult to argue against it. Again, don't know too much about identity politics, but in America, there definitely is a problem with police brutality, with the education system, with healthcare, and how the data is drawn in terms of minorities and white people. In terms of the UK, there are some instances of that, certainly not with police brutality, but there are some cases with miscarriages of justice, with education, with some NHS stuff, to the point where the NHS has had to launch investigations into, for example, maternity deaths, or I've forgotten what they're called, deaths at childbirth and things like that. And in terms of Zara, I think that there were a lot of hyperbolizations of what happened online, with you being bullied and being called a white supremacist and being called a racist, when really we were just disagreeing with you.
I have no idea where that came. I haven't even read any of that.
I'm sorry, but I have seen tweets from you that suggest that. So it
That suggests
it
I'm a white supremacist, or
Because
that I
no,
was
that
called.
suggests that you feel like you've been called a white supremacist.
Oh, okay.
When for the most part your audience was agreeing with you, and there were maybe 4 people disagreeing with you. So within ideologies that involve rioting and with revolutions and things like that, I've made a video clarifying the ideologies that exist. So there's a radical ideology and there's a conservative ideology. I don't quite understand why you would focus simply on the rioting and the violence when that is not the majority of the movement and what the movement is putting out. They're clearly not endorsing the rioting and the violence. And on the other side of the coin, I don't know why also you wouldn't be sharing the petitions and the fundraisers and things like that when those are peaceful forms of protest, but instead just focus on the rioting and the vandalism, which is an extremely conservative stance to take when looking at rioting and looking at revolution. I have
Please going next.
a whole page of things to address, so please allow me some time.
Go for it.
So the first thing, and this was from like 2 rounds ago because I didn't get to address it at all. So I think Halima said that Islamists are hijacking the movement, and there are other people who have their claws in this movement, and they're essentially detracting from the movement. Now, what I will say to that is that with every movement, there are going to be opportunists who derail the conversation for their own benefit. And I don't think that it's fair to focus on them for doing that. For example, within the ex-Muslim movement, we have ex-Muslims or people who claim to be ex-Muslims that will be bigoted towards Muslims. We don't include them as representing us because they are detracting from our movement. And I don't think it's fair for the whole anti-racism, Black Lives Matter movement, whatever you want to call it, to be focused on detractors and opportunists. The second thing that Halima said in the introduction was that it's worse elsewhere, and it's worse. There are worse things happening in other parts of the world. That's not to say that you can't fight for different things at the same time. I don't think it's fair just to say that it's worse for, like, racism, for example, is worse in Saudi Arabia, that we can't talk about racism in the US. I think it's pretty uncanny that, especially in the South, there is this sense of racism that exists. And to an extent, I do think that all of us inherently will have prejudices, and there's very little we can do about that on an individual level. But I think it's really, really imperative to address something that may exist in the system. And I'll get to that as we move on. As to like books, movies, and things like that being recalled, I don't think that's fair. I think that those things should exist. Like, as someone who, you know, is literary and I enjoy literature, I think it's a reflection of a time, and that should remain. To what Zara said about white privilege and that you don't think white privilege is a thing, it is a thing, and I don't think you fully understand what white privilege is. When we talk about white privilege, we're not comparing a white person and a black person from 2 different social groups. We're talking about privilege that exists within the same social group and within the same circumstances. So, for example, if you have a white homeless person and a black homeless person, there is a likeliness that white people will be treated differently. Again, I do want to reiterate that I'm not an expert on race issues or identity politics, because it's just not a brilliant use of my time. But I do want to say that there does exist instances of white privilege within the same social category, which is how it's meant to be used. Now, I do understand that those terms are used in order to disparage people, to silence people, and I do not disagree with that. And I do understand that there are certain people within the Black Lives Matter movement who are sort of suppressing white people and getting them to kneel and wash their feet and all kinds of crazy stuff. But that does not mean that that idea or the existence of white privilege is not there. It definitely is, in terms of like people have been having this conversation for a long time in terms of like interviews and job searching. There's actually a stat that I looked at that there is actually white criminals are more likely to be hired than black people who don't have a record at all. And I wrote that down somewhere, but I have so many stats at this point, my mind is just spinning. But I mean, I'm happy to send all of that afterwards.
I'd like to see that one particular one that you just cited.
I'll send it to you if you give me a second to find it. Actually,
so no, WhatsApp it me afterwards. Don't worry.
Okay,
whenever.
all
Take
right.
your time.
To move on to, so I addressed detractions from the thing. The nuanced discussion, I do agree that we should be able to have this discussion, and it's a shame that that people are being silenced, and I don't like that. I too have white friends that I've been having this discussion with, and they feel like they're being silenced because they feel as though they can't have a voice in this. And I feel like everyone should. I think that disagreement is healthy. I think that disagreement is good. It's what makes the world go round, and that's how we come to conclusions. In terms of segregation, I do not agree with it. I think it's definitely going backwards. It's a very Magneto-esque argument in an X-Men world. And I don't like it. In terms of political blackness, again, I don't know enough about race politics or identity politics to quite understand that. But when I was talking about blackness in terms of racism, I was talking about it within the context of the South Asian community, in that blackness is seen as something dirty within our community. It's seen as something unfavorable or something ugly in our community, and that's where I use the word blackness, not necessarily in terms of the political movements and stuff that exist now. To discuss police brutality, the first thing I want to say is that police brutality isn't the only systemic racial thing, and I think there are other things that we can talk about. In terms of data, I think that data without context and with it being completely cold and, unrationed can be very, very tricky. To speak about there being a high criminality within Black societies without also thinking about why that might exist and whether that might come out of systemic oppression is also something that needs to be addressed. For example, in the UK, I think that more Black students are suspended as compared to white students. And if you look at the numbers in terms of that, if you are suspended from school or you are, I've forgotten what the word is. As an educator, this is bad.
Expelled?
But expelled, that's it. If you are expelled from school, your likeliness of becoming a convict in future becomes higher. So are criminal levels in Black communities, is there a racial divide within the schooling system? Is there a racial divide in other things that aside from police brutality? And to continue with that, with violent crime, and you saying it's higher for Black people, I think that again would be, where does that come from? Why is that an issue? And are those issues being addressed? I think that it's really, really important. Whether or not it's a racial issue, it needs to be addressed. And in terms of brutality isn't purely just shootings. It could be any form of violence towards a civilian by someone in power or a government official like the police. So while the stats talking about police brutality might be with regards to people shooting others, it doesn't necessarily mean that there are other things that can be taken into account, like beatings. For example, George Floyd's death did not occur out of a shooting. It occurred because he was essentially choked to death. You can still have people being choked, but that not showing up in the statistics. And also, when we look at statistics like that, for example, if we look at rape statistics, we can probably discern that those aren't going to be accurate because women do not like reporting rape statistics. In terms of police brutality and the people who survive it, how do we know that those things are being reported, especially when it's your word against a police officer's when they have a certain level of power? I think that is something that deserves to be taken account of. Also, you mentioned that the white man who was shot because he attacked a police officer with a spoon, that was a piece of evidence that you stated. I think that is something that needs to be addressed. That if that is what it takes to get a man shot, is that he flies at you with a spoon, then that is something that is deeply ingrained within the police system, and it's something that needs to change. And also, if that kind of chokehold that George Floyd died under, like as someone who's worked security and also works with people who have mental health issues, I've done a significant level of training for self-defense and for prevention, and if that is something that is if that is what police officers are trained with, then there is something wrong in that system, because there are certain things that I've had to learn about my job and the risks that I undertake that are honestly shocking to me, but they make sense. You can't block someone's air path like that. I've had to sustain bites because it would block somebody's air path to do anything but to sustain it until you get someone else to like deal with it. And in addition to that, the police officers who were responsible for George Floyd's death, the man who killed him, had 3 counts of brutality before that. Why do we not have a zero tolerance policy for brutality with police officers in the US? Another one of the, I believe it was the Asian man, I can't remember his name, who was also at the scene of that
He
death.
also had stats.
He also had a strike. So why is there no zero tolerance policy for that? To say whether or not that was racially motivated, I think we can never truly know. So Jimmy also said that there's a high propensity for black on black violence. I think that that is a problem and that does need to be addressed. And it's something that people aren't talking about, and I do agree that that needs to be talked about. In terms of generalizations, that all police are racist or all black people or whatever, I think that generalizations is something that we should just avoid entirely. It's not, like, for the sake of a conversation, perhaps, but it is not helpful to generalize communities of people and say that all police are racist or all, black people hate white people, or all white people hate black people. I think it's a bad idea. I think that there is still room for improvement. I think that there are issues that are still worth talking about, and I understand the frustration of the way the media is handling it and the way that it's sort of pigeonholed into issues and the way that speech is being limited. I do not agree with the way that the media is presenting these issues. However, I don't think that just by saying that things have gotten better that we solve the issue. There's clearly an issue going on. In terms of the race traitor stuff that Jimmy brought up, yes, I agree that we should not be treating people who are minorities in opinions like that. And I completely condemn that. I don't like that behavior at all. I think that everyone has a voice and everyone has their opinions and they're allowed to state whatever they feel. Actually, they should state how they feel. Like I said, that's the only way we're going to reach some even marginally good conclusions. 9 people, the 9 black people who were shot unarmed last year, that's fair enough.
We need to do is we need to start it from the beginning. Sorry.
The last thing that I would like to address before I make some points of my own, because I've just been addressing points at this point, Zara said that this is a US issue. Even if I were to agree to disagree that this is just a US issue, that does not mean we can't protest about it. There are several things happening.
No, we can. We
okay,
absolutely
but
can.
the way that you phrased that was almost like, oh well, these problems don't exist in Australia.
No,
these problems don't exist in Africa. But the likelihood of Caribbean black kids of being excluded from schools over white kids is 3 times. Martin Neri, the former director of the General of HM Prison Service, the 13,000 young people excluded from school each year might as well be given a date by which to join the prison service sometime later down the line. 4 out of 1,000 stop and searches of whites, as compared to 38 out of 1,000 stop and searches compared to blacks. That again could be due to crime stats here in the UK, but I don't know. Police brutality. There were only 78 days in 2019 where police did not kill somebody. So police brutality is a problem. Whether or not it's racialized is another conversation. In Buffalo, in New York, 12 out of 1,000 people is the rate of violent crime, and there were no police killings from 2013 to 2016. 99% of killings by police from 2013 to 2016 have not resulted in police officers being charged with a crime. Unarmed black people were killed by police at 5 times the rate of unarmed whites in 2015. Only 13 out of 104 cases in 2015 where an unarmed black person was killed by the police resulted in officers being charged. Only 4 cases have resulted in convictions, and none of these cases resulted in more than 4 years of prison time. Black people were more than 4 times likely than whites to be detained under the Mental Health Act, and that's in the UK. Black women have a significantly higher pregnancy mortality rate than other ethnicities, possibly due to antenatal care here in the UK, and this is being investigated currently by the NHS. There is the existence of white privilege, but we've discussed that already. There are so to compare 2 case studies, in terms of the Central Park joggers, which happened in 1989, teens were given these are black teens that were given an adult sentence for a crime that they were accused of, in which none of their DNA was matched to the ones at the scene. If we compare this to the Brooke Turner case, which was a confirmed unconscious rape of a woman with 2 witnesses, and Turner was held at the scene of the crime, he was given 6 months in prison time, whereas the Central Park joggers were given between 5 and 10 years. And by the way, Brooke Turner was only held for 3 months, and that was in 2015. The reaction, if we're going to talk about violence within the protests that are currently going on, we also have to consider the reaction to the protests with the use of tear gas, rubber bullets used inappropriately, police officers hiding their badge numbers, undercover officers, and the hijacking of radical parties, as well as Trump's incitement against the protests through his tweets. If we look at Thomas Lane, he was let off after £1 million were raised to get him out of jail. Defendants charged with killing whites in Georgia are 3 times more likely to be sentenced to death as defendants charged with killing blacks. In the McCleskey v. Kemp situation, 6 out of 11 defendants convicted of killing whites would have not gotten the death penalty had their victims been black. 20 out of 34 black defendants would not have received the death penalty had their victims been black. Over 60% of death row inhabitants are black. Pennsylvania, 6% of the black population. I have 1 point left to make. 1990 to 1992, 130 reports of police brutality by Florida University that was recorded. Blacks and Hispanics made up 97% of the victims, while white officers involved were over 93% in the beatings.